My name is Monk Rowe. We're filming in Manhattan for the Hamilton College Jazz Archive. It's a very big pleasure for me to be speaking with Lew Tabackin today, jazz flautist and tenor saxophonist and band leader. Welcome.
Okay.
Was that an okay introduction?
It's an okay introduction, but you don't have to say flautist.
Yeah, I was going to ask before.
You know, we don't have to be so pretentious. Flute player would do. Band leader, not really.
Okay.
That's kind of like, you know, Toshiko has a band. She writes all the music.
Right.
She conducts. I mean, she does everything. I, you know, play a lot of solos.
Yeah.
And occasionally call people up, do a little contracting work.
Right.
But I'm a pretty bad band leader. In fact, sometimes she has to take off. We play a steady Monday night at Birdland here in New York. And occasionally she might be in Japan, and they say, well, do it without her. So I do it. And it's like if you saw like an symphony orchestra playing without a conductor. It's kind of like that. And if we kind of marshal our forces and like really work at it, we can pull it off.
Yeah.
And there's never another piano player because she doesn't have a piano book.
Ah.
It's all her music, and she knows her own music, so she doesn't have a piano book. So it's kind of interesting when she's not there. But
yeah.
As far as me being a band leader, it's open to question.
Okay, well, at least you're honest.
Yeah, I try to be honest.
You're one of the few saxophonist flutists that started out as flutists, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of in a classical direction?
Well, what happened, I mean, I started with my first instrument. Actually, when I was a kid, in the Philadelphia school system, they could lend you instruments. They had a program, and they could provide some kind of a teacher. And I wanted to play, I thought it'd be nice to play something, and I thought maybe a clarinet. I don't know why, but and I guess I had seen movies of people playing the clarinet, but they didn't have one. They had a flute, which I knew nothing about, and no one knew nothing about, and no one cared anything about in those days. But through default, I got the flute. You know, so I fooled around with it, and they gave me a teacher who taught me everything wrong.
Oh.
I mean, it's like when you learn things from the beginning, when you learn the wrong fingerings and the wrong position, it takes a long time to get rid of those habits. But in any case, I started playing the flute, and it wasn't a very serious endeavor. Something to do. I could play in the school orchestra,
yeah,
et cetera, et cetera. But when I got into high school, you know, I started to hear a little jazz. Guys would be playing like after orchestra rehearsal, they have 5 minutes between classes. They'd be jamming a little bit, or after school. I said, and a next door neighbor had a jazz record collection, and I started to hear some jazz. I was 15, and it was kind of, then all of a sudden music started to have a little bit of meaning. It was more than just something to do, and you know, then I got a saxophone maybe a year later, and you know, that opened up music to me. Jazz music opened up the door to music.
Can you remember the kind of jazz you were hearing early on then?
Well, the first stuff I heard was, well, since I played flute, this friend next door, he played me some stuff like Milt Jackson, Frank West, you know, those things,
yeah.
Opus de Funk, those kind of, which was really kind of, I said, wow, that's nice, and, you know, Herbie Mann had a hit record or something. He did a Charlie Parker, Little Suede Shoes, whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, I was very unsophisticated, and then I would just try to play. I didn't know what I was playing. It was just like, but it was exciting. You know, you never can quite recapture the exuberance of being totally ignorant. You know, just start playing, not knowing what you're doing.
No chords, no nothing.
The thrill of it
yeah.
is so incredible. You can never recapture that naivete, you know. I think...
I think I have to quote you on that. I think you just said the thrill of ignorance. That's a great little line.
I mean, it's like, you know, you play, it's so exciting just that you're doing, you know, you're actually playing, and it's like the first, you know, like when you first hear some music, and it might not have been great music, great jazz music, but it was really exciting. And then when you get more sophisticated, you start to analyze, you know, what you like, what you don't like, what is right, what is wrong, so that you can never listen to music in the same way, which is good and bad.
Yeah.
You don't get the shivers so much. It takes an awful lot to really move you. So that's the dues.
Right. You studied with some fairly well-known names, including Julius Baker, is that right?
That's a myth.
That's a myth.
I didn't study that much. I studied, well, I mean, I played in the all-state orchestra, whatever it was called.
Yeah.
And all-city, or whatever. We used to get together, and I guess once a week. So if you played in that orchestra, you could get a scholarship. You had a good chance of getting a scholarship. So I got a scholarship to Philadelphia Conservatory of Music, which was a really classical, stodgy, stuffy kind of a environment. They didn't believe, they you know, forget about jazz music.
No jazz in the practice rooms,
No
right?
saxophones. So I had to major in flute. But at that time, I was really interested in playing jazz. So I'd be out, and, you know, playing gigs and trying to learn how to play. And I really didn't spend a lot of time dealing with the flute, so I was pretty bad. I mean, I was like terrible. Until, I mean, I had a couple of teachers from the Philadelphia Orchestra at that time. But the last teacher I got, his name was Murray Panitz, who I think he passed away. He joined the orchestra, and I kind of liked him, and he introduced some very basic concepts of how to play the flute that really appealed to me. And there were things that, you know, that I could work on, you know, for the rest of my life. It's like I teach, once in a while I give somebody a lesson. I'm not a real teacher, but I try to give them a concept, a basic thing that they can work on, you know, and they can do it forever, like I'm still doing it. Instead of, like, you know, spoon feeding, you know, like we do a little of this, and they come back next week, we do a little more. I just give them the whole concept and have them work on it. And he had some ideas that I thought were really quite interesting to me, and then I started to get interested in the flute again. And also what happened was that the flute techniques that I learned from him, that were inspired by him, I began to transfer to the saxophone. Because in the 50s, most saxophone players played very diatonic. There wasn't a lot of intervals or octave jumps, or it was something that you just didn't do. It was kind of, you know, even Coltrane didn't do that. It was scalar, basically.
Were you at all affected by the popular music that was going on at that time, or were your listening habits pretty well set?
Yeah, I wasn't, you know, I missed the pop music period. Like a lot of the people that I play with, you know, usually younger people, they all said, you know, most of them started listening to the pop music of their time, and some of them even played other instruments like guitars and Fender bass, electric basses, whatever, and they were involved in music of their pop music of their time. I mean, I wasn't. I totally rejected it. From the age of 15, I didn't deal with it at all.
Yeah, because the rock, let's see, mid-50s rock and roll was just kind of percolating and
Well, I had no
entering
interest.
the airwaves.
Well, I grew up in South Philadelphia, and South Philadelphia High School was a hotbed of teenage idols and,
Oh yeah,
you know,
that's right.
American
Fabian
Bandstand.
and all those guys, yeah.
You know, I was a classmate of Frankie Avalon. I mean, that was Chubby Checkers and all those kind of people. So that was, but I had no interest in that. You know, it wasn't good for your social life. So that was a problem. But I mean, I was really dogmatic and inflexible. and I knew what was supposed to be happening, what wasn't happening. But it was interesting. But anyway, the flute thing. Again, so I transferred some flute stuff to the tenor, and like I felt I could play 2 or 3 octave jumps. I could figure out how to do that stuff, and by dealing with the overtones like you do when you play the flute. Overtones are essential to learn the overtone series. And not that it was a new thing. People did that on saxophone also, but I became more aware of how that worked. And when I became aware of how that worked, I spent a lot of time figuring out how to do, multiphonics things. I figured I heard Yusuf Lateef once play like a low B flat and overblow it and got the F, and he just could sustain it. I said that was pretty hip. And so I tried that, and it wasn't so hard to do. And I figured that if I really worked hard and really tried, I could find a way to get the third in there somehow. So I kind of experimented and found ways to create multiphonics that were not, basically that were, how to describe, they were consonant. They were like, almost in tune. Not, like people used to play them just for effect.
Just for the effect in it.
But I
sometimes wasn't very musical.
Yeah, I would break my jaws till I found a way to play, like if I want to play a G triad to a C, I can do it, in the context of the music, which I still do, and to this day. But it was an interesting period. So we're kind of going around in circles, but basically I started on the flute, but I wasn't really into it. When I started the saxophone, then I got interested in music. And when I got interested in music, then everything started to make sense. The flute, I started to, years later, I started to deal with the flute as a special thing. And I worked on my own. I didn't study with Julius Baker. I listened to Julius Baker records.
I see.
I didn't study with Ron Paul. I listened to his records. Yeah. I'm not a good student. I prefer to, I used to listen to William Kincaid. And so I used to listen to records to try to get some inspiration and draw on what I thought was the essence of the sound that people got. Same thing with jazz music. I listened to players not so much to copy their solos, but to get the spirit, to absorb their spirit so that I could have a repertoire of spirits and feelings. And like, if you hear Lester Young, there's a certain buoyancy that you hear that no one else has, a certain kind of thing. If you hear Hawkins, a severity, that's so severe. Ben Webster, Toshiko has a great description, kind of a tragic beauty, which is kind of, it's kind of, even he makes himself cry. You hear Don Byas, you hear all the great players, of course, Sonny Rollins and Coltrane. You hear the essence, and you take it in, and then it kind of like cooks like for years and years, and then all of a sudden it becomes something. Hey, I actually have my own thing, and then all of a sudden you realize that I have a voice that is actually my voice.
Cool. The Grove Dictionary of Jazz had a description about you. Actually, I was going to ask you first if you could write your own description of yourself. Would that be hard?
That's very difficult, I think. It's really hard to. First of all, you don't know where you fit in the scheme of things, and you don't know how other people perceive you. I don't know. It would be kind of complicated. Some kind of a schizophrenic simulator of something. I don't know. It's really hard. Because I can't really describe my playing. That gets me into trouble because I'm really not quite characterizable in a sense. A lot of people just say mainstream, traditional, but I'm not. I really don't think I am. I appreciate and respect the tradition.
Let me read what this person wrote about you. He says, his flute solos incorporate both an Asian influence and rich classical style. While he's a rugged tenor soloist, influences include Don Byas, Ben Webster, and Sonny Rollins.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's true.
Okay.
I mean, it's basically true.
Yeah.
You know, I would hope that my saxophone playing has a little more to offer. You know, it's easy to be dismissed. That's why my last album, I didn't play any flute on my last recording, called Tenority. First of all, I thought that one reason, it's easy to make an album where you play, you know, when you have, like most of the recordings I do have a fairly limited budget, so you have maybe a quartet setting, and which is fine. And you play a couple tunes on tenor, play one on the flute, so there's built-in variety.
Yeah.
It's very easy to make an album that people feel that, well, they've heard the different colors and different feelings. To just play the tenor, it's a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, a little more demanding on your...
It's demanding on, you know, in creating variety without, you know, losing, you know, the essential direction. So, and also, I wanted to prove a point, you know, that, you know, listen to the saxophone, listen to the tenor, and like, you know, when you do more than one thing, people have a tendency to label you a craftsman, you know. Oh, he plays the flute, he plays the tenor. Oh, he's a craftsman, he's not an artist. It's the classic, like the classic definitions, I'm not talking about myself in this case, but the definitions of genius always deal with people who are functioning in a limited kind of approach. Like a Thelonious Monk is a classic genius, because his you know, he functions in a world that is beautiful and in a way so personal, and you know, he is that's what you get. Thelonious Monk is what he is, and that's what you get. If he dabbled in other things, he wouldn't have as much, I don't know if I'm explaining myself, credibility. And so people tend to say, oh, well, he must have studied hard or something, and so he can play the flute and he can play the saxophone. So it's kind of, he's not really he's just like a craftsman. Like I've done some studio work in my day that also kind of taints people's perception.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, a lot of people in the who are supposed critics and people in power have a tendency to listen and perceive things with preconception. They listen with their eyes, and if you don't fit the demographics, if you don't fit, and you actually can do more than one thing. I was put down once because somebody called me. There was an article, I didn't even see it, the Zelig of jazz.
The what?
Zelig. Do you remember that movie with Woody Allen?
Oh, yeah.
Woody Allen in this movie, he could change. He was like a chameleon. If he was any environment, he would change into that person. So, his young bass player read it, and he said, "What does that mean?" And it really irritated me because the fact that the way I play, I hope, I try to make the way I play broad enough to encompass almost the history of jazz music. I play the same way. The frame is different.
Yeah.
If I'm playing with a quote-unquote traditional group, like an all-star group that I'm thrown into, I'm playing what I play, just that if you have enough sensitivity, you kind of like play in the spirit, and it's the same sound, it's the same thing. If you're playing, I used to play with, like in the '60s, with out groups, and the next day I play with Roy Eldridge, and I don't consider that a negative, but the Gary Giddens of the world consider that a negative. It's kind of like you know.
Is that because it's harder for them to then
They can't
put you where they want to put you?
They don't know where to put me. And it's very, I think it must be frustrating. A lot of musicians have had that problem because well, he's not an innovator. Is he a copier? I'm not a copier. I mean, people have said, tried to do the Sonny Rollins thing with me, you know. And in fact, I love Sonny Rollins. And some of the greatest music I ever heard in my life was Sonny Rollins playing. He's a great, one of the great improvisers. It's a cliche, but it's true.
Yeah.
I mean, you leave a gig with Sonny Rollins, and when I was a kid, and you're excited and laughing and happy because his music was so much wit, and you never knew what was going to happen. You went to a Coltrane performance, you were kind of like mesmerized. You're walking out in a trance.
Yeah.
And I lost track of what I was saying, but they used to do they say, well, he's a Sonny Rollins guy. I mean, of course, he's, influence, but I remember Leonard Feather asked Sonny Rollins, he said, what do you think about these guys like Lew Tabackin who, are, so heavily influenced by you? And Sonny said, well, I don't hear it that way. I don't hear that Lew, I think he's coming from another direction. And I am and I'm not, I am and I'm not. Just like the beauty of when I was listening to Sonny Rollins, when I finally became, I used to be a Coltrane, when a 20-year-old kid, I used to be a Coltrane guy. And when I started to realize it was stupid to be somebody else. You get up on the bandstand and pretend to be somebody else. So I asked some guys who were older than me about, the older players, players that, some of the giants that I wasn't so that familiar with. And one guy played me a bunch of records like Lester and Ben Webster, Bias, Hawkins. Hawkins I couldn't understand. It was too hard for me. I couldn't. It's like it was too strong at that age. It was too different than anything I was dealing with. But anyway, I started to listen and experience that, and also Hawkins became actually one of my favorites and great source of inspiration later when I was more able to experience. It's like when you first drink wine, your palate obviously grows. And in any case, so when later on I'd listen to Sonny Rollins, and then I'd have another perspective, and I'd hear things that I heard in these other players, and it gave me insights into how to eventually have my own style. And it's by absorbing the music and the spirit and the feeling of the people that you can relate to. It all, like, back to what I said 10 minutes ago, it all comes together and becomes something different. And every once in a while, one of the elements kind of shows its head, and it's beautiful. Because when you're playing and all of a sudden you play something and it says, oh, that's, like, where did that come from? That's Hawkins. And it's like some spirit looking down on you, sound, corny and mystical, but you feel connected. You feel that you're really a part of the continuum, and you're part of you're a branch of the tree, and all the blood is flowing through you, and when it pops out, I mean, I was doing a live recording in Denver, and playing, and before I got to play, I don't know what happened, but somebody was playing a CD or something before, and like about 30 seconds of Coleman Hawkins popped out. I don't know, unless I was hallucinating. And I heard it right before I was about to start this tune. And it kind of like, it was a strange feeling, and it lifted my music. It was strange. It was like, I don't know what, it just all of a sudden, I do a lot of things, kind of like Sonny Rollins. I'm not like Sonny Rollins, but I mean, like, I adapted a lot of the things that I used to enjoy that he did, and you just start playing by yourself, and then, you know, like instead of counting off a tune, you just start playing.
Yeah, right.
And then you reach a point where it's, you know, you establish a tempo, and you know, sometimes you decide on what tune it is going to be, actually, and then the band comes in. I love that way of playing because it's so organic. I think that was some of the most beautiful things that I've experienced as a listener when Sonny Rollins did that. And I try to, in my own way, my own small way, utilize that concept, and I like it. So, and I heard this thing, and I don't know where it came from, and it just like, it was just something that lifted, you know. So I'm really very much, you know, hopefully in tune with you know, with the masters. And so when you, like I tell, once in a while I try to, someone asks me to help them if they're playing. I'm not a real teacher, but I do once in a while. And I try to tell them that, you know, okay, all the young guys, they, you know, they have a little sphere of influence. The guys that are in the Joe Henderson sphere, guys in the Coltrane sphere, guys are in a whatever they choose, and they feel there's really safety in this little area of influence. And I mean, I did it when I was 20, you know, also, but there are guys that are, you know, well into their career still doing it. And I try to tell them that if you can expand your repertoire of experience and have the, you know, experience more listening and open yourself up to, what's the right word, a larger repertoire of sounds and feelings, then your music can be so much more rich instead of like, well, you know, being hip. You know, the whole concept of art versus fashion. You know, everybody has to be hip. It's fashion. Okay, hip today is not hip tomorrow.
Right.
But art is always hip. Art is forever. And, you know, I try to tell them that, you know, okay, if you can play one note 50 different ways, you have an advantage. You can express much more than if you can only play one note 2 different ways, loud or soft. You know?
Yeah.
If you can play with a soft subtone, a loud subtone, a hard tone, different nuance, different kind of vibrato, different, you know, it's kind of like when you take, I listen to some shakuhachi music. It's going back to the flute. And if you play an instrument that's got 8 notes, right? You don't have a chromatic instrument. You have to really learn how to do a lot with one note. And you can create an incredible amount of emotion and feeling with one note if you really, you know, or it's like if you're playing jazz music, if you only know one note, man, you have to play a lot. You have to do a lot of stuff with that one note. You know, there are people that don't know anything about music or history, and they sit and listen, and they can tell you what they felt and what they thought you were trying to do, and they can nail it. I mean,
from a very intuitive kind of.
I mean, I meet little girls and stuff, like, or old people, and they come and they start talking about this real shit, the real stuff that, you know, is important. And it's encouraging because there are people who can really understand music. I mean, the essence of music, not who played what in what year and who was influenced by who and who, you know, and all this bullshit.
That's kind of all just the historical logistics of it.
I mean, there are guys in Japan that, I mean, know everything, man. You know what every record date, who was on it, and what time it was, and don't understand a damn thing about this music.
That's wild.
Or there are people that know everything about wine that don't have it, or don't have the faintest idea what the real taste is.
They just know the vintages and the companies.
John Faddis knows, like, he knows everything. He doesn't drink. He doesn't drink at all, but he has a, I think it's his chiropractor or somebody who was a wine guy, and he's always talking to him about it, and John's got kind of like almost like a photographic memory. So he remembers all this information. He comes over to me and starts mentioning this and this and this. He never tasted anything in his life. You know? He could be a wine writer.
Well, let me just ask you about a couple things. Did you have any inclination that you would spend so much time in a saxophone section of various big bands?
It's a good question. I'll put it to you in a... people might, be shocked in a sense because, you develop a history and people have a preconception. But when I came to New York in 1965, and I would go around and force myself to sit in jam sessions in places where it's possible to sit in, just because you have to. Otherwise, no one will know you exist.
Right.
You have to come up and say, here I am. Here's what I do. Maybe if you like the way I play, I might get somewhere. I might get a gig, or somebody might like the way I play. So at that period, it might sound funny. If you were white, you were supposed to be a good reader. They assumed that you were good. If you were black, no matter how many credentials you had, you were a good jazz player, but you couldn't play. You couldn't read. I mean, if you're white, you're maybe not that good a jazz player, but you could read. So it was like the stereotype thing. So I go out and I'm playing, and trying to do my thing, and these various clubs. And what do? I get a gig in a big band. And I'm not really that qualified. I had no big band experience. In New York, like a lot of the young guys, they'd go out with these little weekend bands, the dance bands, the Buddy Morrows, and the one of the Dorsey orchestras, or whatever the ghost bands were. Excuse me. But I didn't have that experience. So I'm playing at a place called the Dom in St. Mark's Place, and Philly Joe would be playing, and some great musicians. Kenny Dorham would be one of the judges, like judging the young guys if they were qualified. It was a fun time. And so he's another saxophone player. He says, "Oh, I do this gig with Les Elgart, and I can't do it. Would you do it?" And so I start playing. I go out for 2 weeks with Les Elgart, and then he recommends me to his brother. At that point, I learned to not play in the rests.
That's important.
That's important. If you play in the rest, you give yourself away right away. But so I was trial and error. It was a trial and error situation. And then an interesting thing happened. To this day, I don't know why this happened, but I got a call to join Cab Calloway's reunion band. He was trying to put together as many of the old guys as he could. I'm 25, maybe 26 by then, I'm not sure. And I show up in New Jersey, and I go into the dressing room, and what appeared to be really old guys. I don't think they were that old now in different perspective. I see this guy on the floor doing push-ups, and it was Eddie Bearfield.
Oh yeah, he was the real strong guy.
Yeah, he's doing push-ups, and I see all these old black musicians, and I'm this wimpy white guy. I mean, I don't know why, and it was really, but it was a fantastic experience because Eddie became, very helpful to me. He became like a kind of a bit of a mentor. And it was a lead alto player. His name was George Dorsey, who was the most beautiful sound, and he was wonderful. Sam Taylor was in the band.
Sam the Man
Taylor.
Yeah.
A guy named Garvin Bushell, who played the oboe in the Puerto Rico Symphony and stuff. I mean, he was a pretty accomplished guy, highly regarded. And it was a wonderful experience because Cab Calloway had a great library. He didn't play it too often on the gigs. It was all this, Heidi Ho and St. James Infirmary, to death. But when there weren't many people in the house, he let the band go, and play all these Buster Harding charts, sax solos, like on Cherokee. I mean, at that point, I learned to tune in to the lead alto player. It's a lost art now. Now jazz music has become so academic that you have a written page and people read it, even to the point now where you almost have to kind of notate whether it's a straight eighth note or it's a swing eighth note, or it's, because there's so many ways to play eighth notes.
Mm-hmm.
In those days, at least that was the end of a period in a sense that you follow the lead alto player. The music was a guide. Like on the sax soli, where all the saxes are playing, it's like an improvised solo. I mean, sax soli, it's almost like if someone would play a solo and it's orchestrated for 5 saxes, whatever. And the lead alto player would play it the way he would play it. It's not always precisely the way it was notated, so you have to develop a radar system with the first alto player. And if you respect him, and you respect the music, and you really, you develop a real contact. It's almost like a communication.
Mm-hmm.
And which was good and bad, because I love to do that, but on the other hand, it didn't, as far as precision reading, that was another thing.
Mm-hmm.
So my experience in sax sections, was by default, in a sense, and I enjoyed it in certain contexts. And I started to, when I came to New York, Thad Jones and Mel Lewis band had been in existence for maybe a year or less, and I sat in with Elvin Jones once, and Joe Farrell was his gig, and he started sending me in on to stuff for him with Thad and Mel's band.
Mm-hmm.
Same kind of situation, not being that great a reader. But,
I guess.
but that was a wonderful experience. I mean, that was really so open. I never forgot my first gig, one of my first gigs with that band. I think I might have been playing the other chair at the time, and there's a tenor solo, and I'm reading the changes, scared to death, trying to not to step on it, and the whole band stops. And I didn't know what, I thought I must have played so bad that I had to stop the band, or, and then I just kept on playing, fortunately. Because he would do stuff like that. He just stopped the band or cut out people, and I didn't know the modus operandi, and I was, what happened? But my experience in bands were, like, it was kind of, it wasn't my first choice to be playing big bands.
Mm-hmm.
Jazz players always want to play in small groups, obviously. Big bands are something you do. Some people really love big bands. It wasn't my background. I loved Duke Ellington. I loved early Count Basie, before the Tootie band, to be honest.
Before the which band?
Tootie band, before all the big charts. I liked it in the late 30s, Lester Young period. I mean, to me, that's the essence of swing and incredible beauty. But I don't know, sax sections, I like the old style sax sections.
Well, it must have been, can I assume it was partly economic decisions too, you can't just keep turning work down because it's not exactly what you intended to do.
You're trying to survive.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed it. I mean, I'm not putting it down, but basically I wasn't, it's a Peter principle. Like, say, you hear somebody, they like the way they play jazz, and you put them in a big band and there's nothing to play. I mean, it's basically, where there are maybe a lot of guys that could read that part better, but that aren't given that gig. But it's funny. It's a funny situation, but it was cool. I mean, it opened up a lot of. I had some really wonderful big band experiences, and I played with Duke Pearson's band, which was wonderful, because we had a great rhythm section with Mickey Roker and Bob Cranshaw. Duke, sometimes he didn't even play the piano that much. He'd be out there, searching out the ladies. But it was a family band. It was like a family, and we played. Again, the music was written, but we didn't play it. We followed. We found a way to play it that was personal. I remember when Duke Pearson came to Los Angeles, I was living there at the time, and he decided to do a couple gigs and put together a band. So we're rehearsing, and everybody were all kind of mainly studio-oriented players, and they were playing the music exactly the way it was written, and it sounded so strange. I said, and then I said, we never played the music like this. I mean, it was. That's the beauty of, you know, of a quote-unquote jazz band as opposed to a studio band,
Yeah.
or what they later in schools they refer to as stage band. The jazz band is, the only way you can justify a jazz band being a jazz band is to have, obviously to have improvised solos, but also have a certain leeway in, you know, in interpretation
Yeah.
of the written note. It's, the note has to become, you know, personal, has to be, you know, this came to mind. It might be helpful to anybody who's a, you know, player. You might want to think about it. Is I was playing in another band that Al Cohen had, great saxophone player. He was one of my early influences, a wonderful musician. And I was playing, you know, what they used to call fourth tenor. Now they say second tenor. It was
Yeah.
fourth tenor. It's the fourth voice.
Yeah.
The most difficult voice in the sax section.
I agree. It's interesting you say that. You get all the hard.
They always put the
fingerings
worst. They
in
always
it,
put
yeah.
the worst guy on, or girl on the, usually a girl. They put her on fourth tenor because, wow, okay,
Yeah.
it's wrong. The fourth tenor is tough because, like, you're the bridge between the baritone and the rest of the section, so you can't get that real kind of hard, ugly sound in the low register. You have to develop a full low register to balance to make that transitional thing. Anyway, I was playing, and there was an experienced baritone player sitting next to me, a guy who's played Roger Pemberton. He was playing baritone at that time in that band, and he gave me one really great compliment, which I never forgot, because I never thought myself as a section player, and it wasn't my main interest, or I didn't have much experience. And he said, you know, you play your part like it's really, you know, it's like it's really, you know, music. You play each note like you're really, you know, it's important, and with feeling. And so even though your voice, you have a fourth voice, it's not perfectly melodic and like the lead voice, still, that's why Ellington's band sax section was so great. I mean, everybody played as an individual, and the whole was greater than the sum of its parts. Another cliche, but that was the case. And if you just play that music like it's just a note, it doesn't work. It doesn't live. So the responsibility, if you're going to play in this section, you should play in a section and do it right, and not. It's easy to say, hard to do, but try to play whatever part you have like it's really important. It has, you know, and then if everybody does it, then it becomes, you know, beautiful.
Excellent advice.
You know,
Yeah.
I see that all the time. Oh, they put the weakest player on the fourth tenor, and then they ruin the sax section.
Yeah.
Like when I played with Duke Pearson's band, saxes were me and Frank Foster were the tenor players, and he played the bottom tenor, which was right, because at that time my sound changed through the years. At that point, it was kind of I was still in a little kind of Coltrane. My sound was kind of bright, and you know, it was kind of the end of a period for me. And Frank had this lovely, you know, big sound and the full sound on the bottom, so it would have been foolish to reverse, you know, the chairs.
Now, did you guys decide that, or did Duke Pearson recognize
That's an interesting question. I don't know. I probably Duke, and I never thought much about it, because it seemed so right.
Right.
It seemed like the way, you know, it was so correct from a musical point of view, that I didn't question it. And, you know, that's probably what Duke had in mind, you know.
Yeah.
He was a very sensitive guy, and he was always very careful about, people's feelings. Like, if Frank got one more solo than I did on a gig, he'd call me up and say, "Oh, I'm sorry, man," you know, like, if Frank's family was here or something. I mean, I said, "No, come on, man, you know, it's not a problem."
Right.
But I always appreciated that.
If my recollection is correct, in 1969, I was was going to school in Fredonia, New York, and the Tonight Show band came to play for some dance or something. And I believe you were in the saxophone section.
69?
Yeah. Or 60, could have been 68.
Well, it's possible. I didn't play in the Tonight Show band at that time. In 69, Arnie Lawrence, a friend of mine,
Lawrence, yeah.
he recommended me to do this project that Doc Severinsen had, which was a kind of a smaller show type group, supposedly geared to play college concerts and stuff. And it was like singers and dancers and six horns, which was kind of, wasn't that great, but it was interesting because my income went from, in those days, from $4,000 to $5,000 a year to like $19,000, which doesn't sound like a lot today, but it was quite a big jump in my financial situation, mainly because it meant like mostly doing weekend gigs. But what I did get a chance to do, then I would do substitute work on the Tonight Show, because the Tonight Show was a staff orchestra. They had a set orchestra, but I could do subs, which was a great experience, because that band was like, in New York, was like the Rolls Royce of television bands. I mean, that was like, a very great learning experience. There's so much integrity in that. I never experienced that when the band moved to California. It was different. And then it led to other gigs, like I do some work on the Dick Cavett show, because you meet different people. So all of a sudden, but it's possible that I might have done a gig with them, even though I wasn't a regular member of the Tonight Show band at the time.
Okay.
It's possible.
Yeah.
You would have noticed, because I was like much younger than any of those guys in the band, and I probably had a beard, or at least something.
I'm pretty sure you were there, and I know it could have been a sub situation, but I remember Jerry Dodgen and.
Oh wait, that wasn't he wasn't the Tonight Show band.
Okay, well, some of these guys were there, because I remember like thinking, wow, what a cool thing. I know Grady Tate was there, and maybe it wasn't even the Tonight Show band. Maybe it was a kind of conglomeration.
It could be,
but
yeah.
There was some major players.
Was it Clark Terry, maybe?
Clark was there, I think, yeah. But at any rate, you've had the TV experience, the solo albums, some studio experience. Does it get easier to make a living as a jazz musician? I mean, you mentioned this one instance where your income really went up, but that was kind of a
That's not from playing jazz. Exactly.
Yeah.
When you look at I had a little discussion with a good friend of mine, Peter Washington, about one of his heroes, George Duvivier, and he was very proud of the fact that George was a great bass player, and he wasn't, like a showbiz kind of. He was an itinerant musician and a great bass player, and he made, a lot of money in his life. He made a nice living. And I said, but Peter, you realize that a lot of the money he made was from studio work as a utility musician, playing television shows and record dates, and that's a situation that actually existed quite a bit in the 50s and toward the beginning of the 60s, when they had a lot of studio bands were jazz musicians. The music of the day, like all the singers would make a record, it was a jazz-oriented.
Right.
Even the pop singers, they utilized jazz musicians. So you had a crossover, a period where guys would function as studio players and jazz players. Now it's a separation, and so which is probably good, but it is, that's the way it is. As far as me making a living, today as opposed to then.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's difficult in a sense because music has changed. I mean, the concept of marketing and approaching jazz music has changed. There's a lot of lip service to the fact that jazz is finally recognized as an art form, but the practical reality is it's being marketed as pop music. So you have who's hot and who's not, and record companies saying, well, if we don't promote young musicians, young people won't listen to the music. Creates this whole demographic problem where it's difficult. It gets difficult where it shouldn't be difficult, but it's people from my generation have to really fight in a sense to maintain and develop. I consider myself in the process. I'm ongoing development. I'm not, I have to get better. And the only way to get better is to play a lot.
Yeah.
To play, not just practice, to play. And so I kind of connect the two. The income thing is important. It's secondary to the ability to keep on working. The more you work, the more you develop. So it's all kind of connected. So for a jazz musician today, it's very difficult. If you're fortunate, or I don't know if it's the right term, to have support by powers to be and the record companies, etc. It's helpful, but there are pitfalls to that. It's a difficult time.
If you or Toshiko or some of your other friends wanted to get a date, let's say at the Iridium or Birdland or Sweet Basil's, what do you have to do to make that happen? And is it hard?
It's hard. I mean, in a sense, unless you're really look. I'm doing the band plays every Monday, but that's a special thing.
Yeah. At
Birdland. So I'm doing a date of my own next month, and I have a little trio. I mean, we actually have a group. We play together.
That's
and we
that's
actually have a repertoire, and we have communication, and it's a group. Now I go and say I want to do a weekend. Oh well, we need an all-star group. I said, well, why? I mean, most of the all-star groups don't sound that good to me. People don't care. It's names. They want to see names.
Yeah.
So I had to make a compromise, and he said, well, you can at least have to have another player added to the group to have
that's interesting.
To build up the interest. So Nicholas Payton is doing it. Who's a wonderful young musician, and that's fine. But at this point in one's life or career, however you want to look at it, to have to deal with that kind of situation where in order to get a gig, you have to hype up, or use another hook.
Right. Yeah.
And just let me. I know when I play, my music is accessible because I don't play. It's not an intellectual experience. I try to be a communicator and kind of have a dialogue with the audience.
Right.
I don't play in a vacuum, and I usually have no problem wherever I go, whether it's in Europe or Asia or Canada. It's like, but oh well, in New York we're competing with we're competing with the Blue Note, and they're having blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
And, and the record company, Blue Note, is taking over the world, with this Blue Note world, so they can
Yeah.
reissue all the old records and not pay anything for them.
Uh-huh.
And then you have Verve, and meanwhile, people who are not affiliated with a major company are like, well, if I want to get a gig at a club, it's like it would be, I have to really work very hard and keep on
Yeah.
pitching, and I'm not good at that.
It's a very right-on statement you said about the marketing. I hadn't quite thought of it like that, but I even noticed, I went down to this Iridium last night, and there's this application on the table for the new Blue Note Visa card.
Wonderful.
And I from an audience standpoint, I have to say that it seemed that the music was almost being marketed out of touch, because I spent $50 last night, and I'm not even a drinker, and I heard exactly 1 hour of music, and I think 4 songs actually. And I loved the music, but as you said, I don't think the group, I won't mention names, but I don't think the group was a working group. I could see a certain amount of looking back and forth, who's going to do what now on the stand. Great players, but still, how many people can afford to do that, to support the music very often?
Well, like it seems like I missed the heyday of all that stuff. Toshiko had a chance to go on the road with her group and stuff, and played all the different clubs that existed throughout the country. And, the way she describes it, her own experiences and other things that she observed and things that I observed as a listener when I went to clubs as a young person. A group comes in and plays, and they, if it's maybe not a hot group at the time, people like it, they come back the next time. So if you do good, look, the first time you play at the club, maybe your audience is small, but people really like it. Hey, this is happening. They'll come back the next time, and you develop an audience. Here, it's like everything's got to be a sure thing. And also, many times they'll spend a fortune for a sure thing. I won't mention names, but I know groups getting horrendous amount of money to play a week, and they have to fill the club every set, every night, which they can't, and they wind up losing money. Where if they hire me, it doesn't cost them so much bread, and they'll make a profit. But it's not high profile enough, it's not like, it's not Joshua Redman or whoever's hot at the period, one of the young, people that are being promoted. But they've alienated the audiences. The sad part is that the older audiences, they heard the stuff. They're not impressed by the toy jazz groups that they hear. They've heard the original. So they'll still go home and listen to their CD player or their records even. They even have records. And why should they go out and spend $200 for a couple or $150 to hear something that's not that they've heard better before? Why should they do that? The young people, it's still jazz music. It's still not, young people, it's still a kind of a little bit too intellectual for them. It's not rock and roll. No matter how they market it, it's only going to attract X amount of young people. So I think they're going about it the wrong way, but who am I? I think if they leave it alone and let it be art music for people who really love it and appreciate it, instead of try to make it a higher level of pop music. I don't know.
Let me just wrap up here with a piece. You recognize that, of course.
Yeah.
Now, I have two quick questions. One's easy. If I was, or probably wouldn't be able to do it, if someone could write that solo out, Could you play it?
No.
Okay.
You can ask Toshiko.
That was easy.
I mean, I play in the band. Toshiko writes really hard stuff.
Yeah, I've noticed.
And like, the one time she did an arrangement of a thing on Indiana. I wrote this thing for Don Byas, kind of based on Indiana, and she transcribed one of my solos on from some recording.
Oh.
And I have to play it, and it's really hard.
Yeah.
And it's not my hardest solo either. It got harder as it went on, but that wasn't that hard. But well, also she changed the key on one thing, which made it really hard. But no, my reading skills are really deteriorated. Like,
But even from a technique standpoint, I mean, that's a burning thing. Just, I'm fascinated by the ability not only to conceive of something like that, but to pull it off technically.
well, I think it's, you know, what's interesting is like people always talking about technique. When I was very young, I have a couple of players that I really like, and I hear them, you know, the local guys in Philadelphia, I hear them warming up, and they sound terrible. I mean, they sound like you can really play that good. And then all of a sudden the rhythm section starts and they start playing, this beautiful music comes out, and execution is great. And what the truth of it is it's the mental clarity. If you can conceive, if you can, like, if your thinking is clear, and thinking is not the right word, but if you're in control of the music in your brain and you know, in your concept in your heart, you find a way to get it out. It's like you can be practicing like all the time and you have this great technique, and then if you're not clear on what you're trying to express or what you're trying to play, especially even on a fast tempo, nothing's going to come out. So it's not so much the technique, it's the clarity of thought. I think that is really the key. Many times, you know, I say, boy, I haven't played and I feel terrible, you know. And then for some reason my thinking is clear and I feel like, you know, I'm not distracted. Concentration is probably more correct word. So concentration is good. I find that execution isn't so much a problem because, you know, just moving your fingers. I mean, we can move our fingers fast. What did Charlie Parker say? Somebody asked him about the secret to how great he was and his playing. He said, well, you bite down as hard as you can on the mouthpiece, blow as hard as you can, and move your fingers as fast as they'll go. I mean, it's like that's basically it. But
right.
It's a concentration of a clarity of thought that transcends actually the technique. So I mean, I couldn't read that because it would, I don't know.
It's not supposed to be read.
I mean, if you look at stuff that people have played, I mean, look at some of Dizzy Gillespie's stuff, and some people transcribe it. It's possible. Dizzy couldn't, you know, he wouldn't know where to start, and nobody else would. I mean, that's why improvised music is so wonderful. I mean, you sometimes you kind of like transcend your abilities. Like sometimes when things are really happening. And, so where did this come from? I never practiced this. I never thought about it, but it just comes. And like you do things that can never recreate. So it's very important.
Well, it's a good note to end on, and I appreciate your time today.
Okay.
It's been fascinating talking to you, and you've expressed some things in a way that I haven't heard before, so I appreciate that.
Well, that's good. I'm always glad to. I always feel that whenever I'm involved in some academic situation, like maybe a clinic or a master class, I don't, you know, I try to be honest, and what I feel is something that, an alternative way of thinking about things, because the education system has a tendency to put things in a very, you know, controllable context, and you know, there's only so much you can do. But if I can present a personal, oh, this is the way I think about playing. This is how I play. This is how another way of thinking about music besides what scales go with what chords,
Right,
you know, and
right.
the whole, you know, creative process, what goes on in your body and your mind and your feeling. And I think that I can make a little contribution.
Great. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Enjoyed it.